It was Confederate Memorial Day. And yes, that is something they have, or at least had, on the 26th of April in 1913. Mary Phagan, age 13, was headed to watch the annual parade in Atlanta, Georgia. First, she would stop at the National Pencil Company to pick up her weekly pay. That'd be the last time anybody would see her alive. I'm Mick Biddick, and this is History is Criminal. In today's episode, we're going to look at the trial of Leo Frank and murder of Mary Phagan. If you were hoping to hear the Great Pearl Heist, that was my mistake. I will be presenting that later. The murder of Mary Phagan and subsequent investigation and trial of Leo Frank would send shockwaves across the United States from Atlanta to Seattle and bring up questions of anti-Semitism and trial by media. Atlanta was only 50 years removed from the Civil War, a jewel of the New South. Investment from northern industrialists had brought new industry to the South, but it also created resentment. Economic strain, as poor whites and African Americans competed for the scraps left over by industrialists, added to the racial tension that had festered since Reconstruction. In 1903, Atlanta had exploded in racial violence when newspapers ran unverified stories claiming that black men had rampaged across the city assaulting white women. The riots only ended after the National Guard was called in and martial law declared. Dozens of African Americans were killed before the violence ended. Anti-Semitism was also common, with many people buying into the conspiracy dating back to the medieval period about Jewish people controlling economics. They blamed Jews for low wages, child labor, and all other economic difficulties. Mary Phagan was a walking poster child for the economic troubles of the region. She was born in Marietta, Georgia, to a poor family of laborers. Her father died when she was a small child. Her mother would struggle to keep a roof over the family's head. Despite being a good student, Mary would leave school at the age of 10 and start to work at a textile mill. When she turned 12, her mother remarried John William Coleman and moved to Atlanta. There, Mary would take a job at the National Pencil Company, earning between 7 and 10 cents an hour running the machine that put erasers on the end of pencils. Despite being born in Texas, Leo Frank had come to Atlanta via New York. He took a job as a manager in his uncle's pencil factory. As a northerner in a position of authority over the poor native-born working class, he would have been viewed as a carpetbagger, one of those thousands of northerners who went to the South in the decades following the Civil War and Reconstruction to take advantage in the view of Southerners. Frank, a Jew from New York, would have been a favorite target of those longing for a return to the Old South. On the morning of Saturday, April 26th, Mary left her home around 10 a.m. It was Confederate Memorial Day, and she was headed to the annual parade. Dressed in a cute outfit, carrying a parasol, she planned to stop by work and pick up her pay. Normally, she would have picked up her pay on Friday, but having been laid off on Monday, it was easier for her just to make a single trip to the downtown area. Sometime between 11 and noon, she picked up her pay from Leo Frank in the office of the pencil factory. That was the last time anyone reported seeing Mary Phagan alive. Her family contacted the police and the search was started. With no leads, the people of Atlanta settled in for the night. Then approximately at 3 a.m., Newt Lee, a tall, thin black man who served as the night watchman, found Mary's body in the basement of the National Pencil Company. It was clear she had been brutalized and dragged across the floor, her skirt lifted above her knees and her undergarments torn. She was beaten so badly and was so dirty that police at first could not identify her race. It wasn't until they rolled down her socks that they knew she was Caucasian. She had also been urinated on, and an undisturbed pile of human feces was found at the bottom of the elevator shaft. Also found with the body were 2 handwritten notes, written in the first person, as if Mary, while being assaulted, had written the notes. The notes pointed the finger at Lee, but would soon be discounted. To say the police did a poor job is an understatement. They failed to gather any blood or hair samples. And even though DNA and blood typing evidence didn't exist in 1913, they could have at least told hair color, length, straight versus curly, maybe pointing to or eliminating possible suspects. Reporter Harold Ross not only would walk all over the crime scene, but he actually carried off the murder notes. Lee, who had called the police quickly, not wanting to be a black man found with the body of a white girl, was the first suspect. The note, which read, and I will try to read this as written, as the word choice and grammar and spelling are important here. The note read, quote, "He would love me and lay me down like night witch did, but that long tall Negro did boy hisself. Ma'am, that Negro here did this. I went to make water and her pushed me down that hole. A long tall Negro, black, that ho, it was long, lean, tall Negro. I wrote while he play with me," unquote. The note was oddly written in the past tense as if Mary had survived and was telling the story of her assault, but also saying, "I wrote while he play with me," indicating that this was written while she was being attacked. The narrative seemed illogical and pointed the finger at Lee, a tall, lean black man who worked as a night watch, or as the note said, night witch. It would be unrealistic for Lee to call the police, but leave the notes behind implicating him. It was also observed that the note, which was full of misspellings and grammar errors, while Mary, despite her limited schooling, was said to be a good writer. It wouldn't take Sherlock Holmes to see that the letter was written, most likely by her killer, to point to a scapegoat. The police conducted numerous interviews, questioning dozens of suspects. Over 200 men were brought in, and it would seem that with the lack of any real ideas, that they would just haul in everybody to see if someone cracked. This proved to be less than an effective form of investigation. Lee would be arrested, but released, as it became clear that the note was a ruse. A second suspect was also picked up, Arthur Mullenix. Mullenix was a streetcar conductor on the route that Mary often took between work and home. He had, on several times, commented on how attractive he thought the 13-year-old was. While gross, it is not proof of murder, but it is easy to understand why the police wanted to talk to him. Mullenix didn't help his case by being picked up the next day while he was trying to catch a bus out of town. He was picked up with a suitcase in hand attempting to board a bus in Marietta, Georgia. He was released when he was able to prove an alibi. It does, however, beg the question, why was he in such a hurry to get out of town? In the age of yellow journalism, the competing Atlanta papers each wanted to outdo the other, publishing rumors and theories as facts and posting even the most grisly details, including a doctored autopsy photo in the Atlanta Georgian. The media fanned the flames of public demand for action. The police needed a good suspect as soon as possible. The Atlanta Constitution, not so subtly, hinted that the murder was part of a cultural war that had raged since 1865. Quote, "Our principles were not defeated when we surrendered at Appomattox. There are other enemies, bitter ones, that must be fought. Immigration, labor, the double standard of child labor and white slavery," unquote. Clearly, they viewed the murder as a symptom of the death of the Old South. When the investigation turned towards someone they viewed as an outsider, a northern carpetbagger and Jew, the paper could hardly contain their joy. One would even say it was good they had a northern Jew worthy of this crime, and not a black factory sweep. It would be an African American janitor and a Jewish industrialist who'd become the focus of the case. Leo Frank was the last person known to have seen Mary alive. At approximately noon, Mary had picked up her paycheck from the National Pencil Company and was apparently handed $1.20 from Leo Frank. Her body was found the next day around 3 a.m. by Lee. While Frank was not arrested until 3 days after the murder, it seems police started looking at him from day one. When interviewed, Frank was able to give an alibi for almost all of the 26th, but the forensics of 1913 were unable to give an exact time of death. The best they could was tell that Mary had been killed sometime between noon and 3 a.m. There was no way Frank could account for every minute of a 15-hour time period. Evidence against Frank was weak at best, fraudulent at worst. Police said Frank was nervous when he was being interviewed on Sunday. This might be the side effect of having an employee murdered in your place of business. The police then pressured other workers to say Frank had flirted with Mary, making her uncomfortable. Most of these statements would later be recanted. The police even coerced a local madam into saying Frank had frequented prostitutes and reserved a room for himself and an unconscious girl. Again, the statement would be recanted later, but it had served its purpose. Frank's African-American cook, Manola McKnight, was even held overnight until she agreed to give a statement saying Frank was nervously drinking the evening of the murder. The Georgian ran the headlines, "Police have the strangler," and under it was a photo of Leo Frank. Then, in what could have been a huge break in the case and saving grace for Frank, Jim Conley was found on May 1st rinsing a bloody shirt in the pencil factory. Conley, an uneducated African-American janitor at the pencil factory, was arrested and questioned. Conley was held for 4 weeks and gave varying statements on what had happened on the 26th of April. Police suspected Conley of writing the notes found with Mary's body, but Conley denied knowing how to write. Later, he would admit to being able to write, and a sample of his writing was compared to the notes, and it was a match. Cornered, Conley admitted to writing the notes, but said Frank had asked him to write them, but he didn't know why. Then Frank ordered him to leave the factory. The Georgian ran with Conley's story on the front page. Conley's story would change yet again. This time, he admitted to being in the factory the whole time. According to his new story, Frank had killed Mary, accidentally, then forced Conley to write the notes and dispose of the body. Conley went along with Frank out of fear of being fired. On the 30th of May, the Constitution read, "Conley says he helped Frank carry the body of Mary Phagan to the basement of the pencil factory." The story captivated everyone in Georgia and beyond. Sometime between his arrest and trial, Bliss Snyder wrote the song "Little Mary Phagan." The song would become popular and was recorded by many people over the years. Maybe the most famous version was by Fiddlin' John Carson and Moonshine Kate. The lyrics go like this: "Little Mary Phagan, she left her home one day. She went to the pencil factory to get her little pay. She left her home at 11. She kissed her mom goodbye. Not one time did the poor child think she was going to die. Leo Frank met her with the brutish heart we know. He smiled and said, 'Little Mary, you won't go home no more.'" The poem goes on to tell the story based on Conley's statement, but a verse that seemed to be added later concluded the poem with, "Next time he passed the sentence, you know he passed it well. Solster H.M. sent Leo Frank to hell." Solster would be involved in the trial of Leo Frank. The trial was a circus. The names and photos of jurors were posted in the papers as crowds outside the courthouse could be heard screaming, "Hang the Jew." Newspapers had proclaimed Frank's guilt, calling him to be put to death. It seemed that no one wanted to contemplate Conley being the killer and having named Frank just to save himself. Hugh Dorsey, a politically ambitious prosecutor, was in charge of trying Frank. Dorsey had recently had some embarrassing failures in court and needed a flashy win to help his career. Putting away a wealthy carpetbagger Jew from New York would definitely impress any would-be voters. He would base nearly his entire case on the statement of Conley. When Conley came to the stand, it was very clear that his testimony had been heavily coached. The statement had also been embellished to be even more damning of Frank. Calling police detectives factory workers, they attempted to paint a picture of Frank as a sex fiend and monster. This was in stark contrast to the reality of Leo Frank, a family man and leader in Atlanta's Jewish community who was active in his synagogue. With all the testimony given, it was only Conley's statement that pointed to Frank's guilt. Leo Frank's defense was headed by Luther Rosser, said to be the best criminal defense lawyer in Georgia. Rosser, however, would rely too heavily on racism with the jury in his defense. No white man in Georgia had ever been convicted of a capital crime solely on the testimony of a black man. Rosser was betting that this would hold true, especially when he was able to get Conley to admit that some parts of his testimony were false. Bringing forth a cavalcade of character witnesses, Rosser must have felt confidence when he launched his closing. In summation, Rosser pointed to the inconsistencies in Conley's statement, the recanted statements of the witnesses, the coercion used by the police. He even went as far to say that if Frank wasn't Jewish, he wouldn't have been on trial. Then he pointed the finger at Conley, who had written the notes and was seen washing blood off of his shirt. Dorsey closed for the prosecution by claiming that Frank was a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde figure. He said the people of the Jewish orphan home that Frank helped organize never saw his Mr. Hyde side. While Dorsey never attempted to use Frank's Jewish faith at trial, the newspapers relished in the idea of being able to try a wealthy Jewish man in place of a poor black man. Jurors, known to the public, would have been placing their own lives on the line if they acquitted Frank. It is unclear if they even contemplated the idea. They quickly returned a verdict of guilty, and Frank was sentenced to death. Judge Leonard Roan had presided over the spectacle of trial, one ripe for appeal. The trial would be appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. The appeal was based on the idea that Frank could not have received a fair trial under the circumstances. While the court rejected Frank's appeal, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes dissented, questioning how non-biased a juror could be if terrified for their very lives. Out of appeals, Frank was scheduled to be hanged on the 22nd of June, 1915. Calls came from around the world for Frank's sentence to be commuted to life in prison. Witnesses came forward with stories of coercion by the Atlanta police. Conley's own lawyer had come forward saying he believed Conley was the real killer. Conley's lawyer believed Conley to be protected by double jeopardy as he was already convicted in aiding Frank in the disposing of the body. Judge Roan would pass away before Frank's commuting hearing, even wrote a letter expressing his own doubts as to Frank's guilt. The commission would vote 2-1 to go ahead with Frank's execution. Governor John Slayton launched his own investigation into Frank's case. He was able to find numerous issues with the official story as it was told in court. This included the fact that the human feces at the bottom of the elevator shaft was undisturbed, yet Conley had claimed that Frank had used the elevator to move the body to the basement. As Slayton dug, he became convinced that Frank had been railroaded by a police and prosecution eager to close the case and get a high-profile conviction. While at the time a pardon was not politically possible, he would override the commission and commute Frank's death sentence to life in prison. He would hope that once things had settled down, he could pardon Frank, but he would never get the chance. Commuting Frank's sentence led to riots in Georgia. The governor was hung in effigy in front of his own home. After leaving office, Slayton was forced to flee the state for his own safety. Frank was attacked in prison, having his throat cut. A 2-hour-long surgery would save his life. The shiv missed the carotid artery by only centimeters. Even with Frank serving a life sentence, the Atlanta papers would fan the flames. Thomas Watson of the Jeffersonian openly called for Frank to be broken out of jail and lynched. And on the 16th of August, 1915, a well-organized group calling themselves the Knights of Mary Phagan attacked the jail. Without firing a shot, the Knights took control of the jail, locking the warden and guards in a cell. Frank was then taken away to a waiting vehicle. Frank was driven to Marietta, Georgia, Mary Phagan's hometown. Thousands gathered to watch Frank be hung. Pictures were taken with Frank's body, and bits of clothing were taken as sick souvenirs. His body was taken down and beaten. The Knights of Mary Phagan were far from an anonymous group. It contained one former governor, 2 former mayors of Marietta, the son of a senator, many police chiefs and sheriffs. Many of them would later be present in Stone Mountain, Georgia in 19 when they burned crosses and gave birth to the modern Ku Klux Klan. Hugh Dorsey was paraded on the shoulders of men following the conviction of Frank. He was able to ride that high to the governor's mansion. Thomas Watson, who had successfully called for Frank's lynching, was elected to the U.S. Senate and would also himself later serve as governor of Georgia. A children's rhyme would be passed down following the trial and execution. The type of thing that a little kid might recite in a sing-song voice while jumping rope. It went like this. Little Mary Phagan went to work one day. Little did she know the Jew would take her life away. While most likely a stanza from one of the many variations of the Ballad of Mary Phagan and Leo Frank, it would haunt Atlanta for generations. During the trial and the years that followed, much of Atlanta's Jewish population left the city. One bright spot to come from this miscarriage of justice committed against Leo Frank was in 1913. Due in part to his arrest and the trial, the Anti-Defamation League was formed in New York. An anti-hate group, they are dedicated to stopping the persecution of Jewish people and seeking justice for all. Fast forward to 1982. 85-year-old Alonzo Mann came forward. He said that as a boy he had witnessed Jim Conley alone carry the body of Mary Phagan. Conley had threatened to kill him if he spoke up. Mann's parents had told him to keep his mouth shut. He said he came forward not wanting guilt on his conscience when he died. So who do you think was really responsible for the death of little Mary Phagan? Was it Leo Frank? Was it Conley? Was it maybe the other suspect who was picked up but released when he gave an alibi? Molnex, who was caught trying to flee the area. Tell me in the comments who you think was really responsible for the death of little Mary Phagan. A quick shout out to my sources, Trials of the Century by Mark and Aaron Phillips, that was used for a majority of the sources in this episode. This has been History is Criminal. Come back again in 2 weeks as we take a look at another historic crime